The air in the Comanche Peak wilderness does not just sit there. It waits. It is a thin, hungry substance that pulls the moisture from your skin and the heat from your marrow long before you realize you are shivering. On the 2nd of October 1999, the sky over Larimer County was a bruised shade of blue, the kind that promises a winter that never truly leaves the shadows of the granite peaks. People come to this part of Colorado to find a version of peace that the concrete world denies them, walking beneath the canopy of lodgepole pines and Engelmann spruce. But the wilderness is not a cathedral, and it is certainly not a playground. It is a vast, indifferent machine, made of stone and ancient wood, and sometimes it decides to keep what wanders into its gears. Jaryd Atadero was only 3 years old when he stepped onto the Big South Trail. He was a boy of bright eyes and boundless energy, a small spark of life against the grey, oppressive permanence of the Rocky Mountains. He was part of a group of 11 adults, members of a Christian singles group, who had come to the Poudre Canyon to seek fellowship and the crisp autumn air. His father, Jaryd Atadero, stayed behind at the resort, trusting the group to look after his son on what was supposed to be a simple, scenic stroll. The trail follows the Cache la Poudre River, a churning vein of cold water that carves through the landscape with a violent, rhythmic persistence. The sound of that water fills the ears, drowning out the snap of a twig or the rustle of the brush, creating a wall of white noise that masks the approach of anything hidden in the timber. The group began their trek at approximately 10 in the morning. Jaryd, possessing the restless curiosity of a toddler, was darting back and forth along the path, his small sneakers crunching on the dry needles and decomposed granite. For a moment he was at the front of the pack, then he was trailing behind, then he was weaving between the legs of the adults. The hikers encountered 2 fishermen near the trail, and Jaryd briefly stopped to ask them if they had seen any bears. It was a charming, innocent question from a child who understood the woods only through stories and picture books. The fisherman laughed and told him, "No, not today." Jaryd then ran ahead to catch up with the leaders of his group, his small frame disappearing around a bend in the trail where the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the dirt. That was the last moment of normalcy. Within minutes, the adults realized that the boy was no longer in sight. They assumed he was with the people in the front, and the people in the front assumed he had dropped back to be with the people in the rear. It is a common phenomenon in the woods, a trick of social perception, where everyone assumes someone else is watching the most vulnerable member of the party. By the time they realized Jaryd was truly missing, the silence of the forest had already closed over the space where he had been. They called his name, their voices thin and reedy against the roaring of the river and the sighing of the wind in the high branches. There was no answer. No cry of distress, no sound of a struggle, just the heavy, expectant stillness of the wilderness. The initial search was frantic but disorganized, as these things often are in the first golden hour of a disappearance. By the time the Larimer County Sheriff's Department was notified and a formal search and rescue operation was launched, the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged horizon. Over the next week, the operation would grow into one of the most intensive searches in Colorado history. Hundreds of volunteers, professional trackers, and specialized teams descended on the Big South Trail. They used thermal imaging from helicopters that buzzed like angry insects over the canopy, and they brought in bloodhounds trained to find a scent in the most difficult terrain. The dogs, however, did something strange. They failed to pick up a meaningful trail, acting confused and agitated near the area where Jaryd was last seen. It was as if the boy had simply ceased to exist in the physical realm. The searchers crawled through the underbrush on their hands and knees, checking every crevice and every hollow log. They diverted sections of the river, fearing the child had fallen into the frigid water and been swept away. Divers braved the numbing currents to peer into the dark pools beneath the boulders. They found nothing. No scrap of clothing, no shoe, no footprints in the soft mud near the banks. The weather turned brutal, with snow beginning to fall, dusting the searchers in a cold white shroud. The official search was eventually called off, leaving Jaryd Atadero with a void in his life that no amount of logic could fill. He was left to wonder how a 3-year-old boy could vanish into thin air while surrounded by 10 adults on a well-defined trail. 4 years passed. The case grew cold, relegated to the files of the unexplained and the tragic. Then, in May of 2003, 2 hikers were exploring an area nearly 550 feet above the trail where Jaryd had vanished. This was not a place a 3-year-old could easily reach. It was a steep, grueling climb over jagged rocks and through dense, tangled growth. On a high, lonely ledge, they looked down and saw something that did not belong in the natural world. It was a small blue fleece pullover, its color faded by the sun but still strikingly out of place against the gray stone. Nearby, they found a single white sneaker and a pair of tiny pants. The hikers felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. When investigators returned to the site, they found the physical remains of Jaryd Atadero. It was not a body but fragments. A single tooth. A small piece of a skull. The rest of the boy was gone, scattered or consumed by the elements and the scavengers of the high country. But the condition of the clothing was what bothered the investigators who looked closely. The blue sweatshirt was turned inside out, but it was not shredded. The pants were found in a way that suggested they had been removed, rather than torn off by a predator. There was no blood on the clothing. No signs of a violent struggle with a mountain lion or a bear, which were the convenient explanations favored by the local authorities. A mountain lion does not carefully undress its prey before dragging it 1,000 feet up a vertical incline. The geography of the find was impossible. For a 3-year-old boy to have climbed that distance on his own, he would have had to possess the stamina and the navigation skills of a seasoned mountaineer. He would have had to move through terrain that would have left his clothing in tatters and his skin covered in scratches. Yet the evidence suggested he had arrived at that high ledge in a state that defied the laws of physics and biology. There is a specific kind of horror in the realization that something took that child and placed him there, or that the landscape itself shifted to swallow him and then spit him out years later in a place where he never should have been. The investigators spoke of mountain lions, citing the way they supposedly cache their kills, but even they seemed unconvinced by their own theories. I have spent years looking into these cases, and the Atadero disappearance fits a pattern that is as consistent as it is terrifying. The victims are often at the front or the very rear of a group. They vanish in a heartbeat, often in areas with high granite concentrations and near-moving water. The search dogs are frequently baffled, and the remains, if they are ever found, are discovered in locations that are geographically improbable, often at a much higher elevation than the point of disappearance. There is a sense of a calculated absence, a feeling that the person was not just lost, but removed from the board by a hand we cannot see. The silence that falls over the woods during these events is often described by survivors as the Oz effect, a total dampening of all natural sound, as if the world has been placed under a vacuum seal. The official story remains that Jaryd was a victim of a predatory animal, a tragic but natural occurrence in the wild. But if you look at the forensic details, that story begins to crumble like dry shale. A predator leaves a trail. It leaves blood, hair, and signs of a kill site. It does not carry a child for miles up a cliff face without leaving a single drop of DNA or a footprint. There is something else out there, something that operates on a frequency we are not tuned to hear. It moves through the timber with a predatory geometry, selecting its targets with a cold, analytical precision. It is a shadow that has no source, a whisper in the pines that sounds like a human voice but lacks the soul behind it. Jaryd Atadero has spent the decades since his son's disappearance, seeking answers that the universe seems unwilling to provide. He has faced the cynicism of the public and the apathy of a bureaucratic system that prefers simple lies over complex, frightening truths. Every time a new case emerges, the same questions are asked and the same hollow explanations are offered. We are told to stay on the trail, to carry a whistle, to never hike alone. But Jaryd was on a trail. He was with a group. He was within earshot of 10 people who cared for him. And yet the mountain took him anyway, pulling him into a vertical nightmare that ended on a lonely ledge 500 feet above the world he knew. The wilderness is not a place of comfort. It is an ancient, watchful entity that regards us as nothing more than temporary intruders. When you walk into the high country, you are stepping into a realm where the rules of the city do not apply. There are pockets of the earth where the veil is thin, where the distance between here and somewhere else is only the width of a shadow. Jaryd Atadero stepped into one of those pockets, and by the time the sun set on that October afternoon, he was already part of the mountain. The fragments of bone and the faded blue fleece are not an ending but a warning. They are a testament to the fact that we are not the masters of this world, no matter how many maps we draw or how many trails we blaze. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident, though the authorities would very much like you to believe that it is. It bears a chilling resemblance to the disappearance of Bobby Bizup in 1958. Bobby was 10 years old and staying at a religious camp near Rocky Mountain National Park, not far from where Jaryd would vanish decades later. Bobby was walking a short distance between a fishing spot and the main camp when he disappeared into the heavy timber. Despite an exhaustive search by the military and local volunteers, no trace of the boy was found for a year. Then his remains were discovered high on a jagged ridge in a location that was deemed inaccessible to a child of his age and physical condition. Like Jaryd, Bobby's clothing was found in a state that suggested it had been placed there rather than torn by an animal. The similarities between these two cases, separated by 40 years and only a few dozen miles, suggest a recurring phenomenon that the standard models of search and rescue cannot account for. There is a predator, or perhaps a tear in the fabric of our reality, that frequents the high peaks of Colorado. It chooses the young and the vulnerable, moving them through the landscape in ways that defy our understanding of distance and effort. Until we are willing to look past the easy explanations of bears and lions, the mountains will continue to collect their toll, leaving behind only scattered bones and the lingering icy taste of an unresolved mystery. The air in the Poudre Canyon has a weight to it that the tourist brochures never mention. It is not just the thinness of the oxygen at 7,000 feet, or the scent of drying pine needles. It is the crushing pressure of the granite itself. These mountains are not static piles of rock. They are ancient and patient observers that have watched civilizations rise and fall while they remained unmoved. When you walk into the Big South Trail, you are stepping into a machine of prehistoric indifference. I have spent decades looking at maps that make no sense, and I have come to realize that the wilderness does not care about your GPS or your high-tech gear. It is a realm of shadows and sudden silences, where the distance between safety and the unknown is only the width of a single heartbeat. In the year 1999, on the 2nd day of October, the world changed for a 3-year-old boy named Jaryd Atadero. He was a small child, with bright eyes and a blue fleece jacket that stood out against the brown and green of the autumn forest. He was not alone. This is the detail that the authorities always try to gloss over. Jaryd was with a group of 11 adults who were all friends of his father. They were hikers and outdoorsmen who thought they understood the rules of the trail. They were walking along a path that was bordered by a steep mountain wall on one side and the churning white water of the river on the other. It was a corridor with no easy exits. Jaryd was full of that restless energy that only a toddler possesses. He was running ahead of the group and then doubling back like a small bird flitting between branches. He came upon 2 fishermen standing by the riverbank. These men were the last people to see him as a living, breathing human being. They spoke to him and he told them he was with his group. They watched him walk back toward the trail and then they turned their attention back to the water. In the span of less than 100 seconds, Jaryd Atadero vanished. He did not run away. He did not fall into the river because the water was shallow and would have left a body. He simply stepped into a fold in the world and was gone. When the group realized the boy was missing, the silence of the woods became a physical weight. They called his name until their throats were raw and the echoes mocked them from the high cliffs. There was no response. There was no sound of a child crying or the rustle of a body moving through the dry brush. The search began almost immediately. It was a massive operation involving hundreds of professionals and volunteers. They brought in bloodhounds that could track a scent through a hurricane. They brought in helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras that could detect the heat of a squirrel from a mile away. But the mountain gave up nothing. The dogs were the most unsettling part of the initial search. When they reached the spot where the fishermen had last seen Jaryd, they did not pick up a trail. They did not pull on their leashes or howl at the scent. They simply stopped. They sat down and looked up at their handlers with eyes that were clouded with a strange sort of fear. It was as if the scent of the boy had been sliced out of the air with a razor. The infrared cameras scanned the dark woods night after night, but they found no heat signature. The mountain was cold. It was as if Jaryd had not just disappeared, but had been erased from the thermal reality of the canyon. On the 3rd day of the search, the mountain decided to close the case. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a matter of hours, and a brutal autumn storm moved in. It was not a normal rain. It was a freezing grey wall that turned the trail into a river of mud and then buried everything under a foot of heavy wet snow. This is a recurring theme in the cases I investigate. As soon as the search reaches a critical mass, the weather turns violent. It is as if the environment is intentionally obstructing the recovery effort. The search for Jaryd Atadero was officially suspended, and for 4 long years the canyon kept its secret. The resolution did not come from a professional investigator or a psychic. It came from 2 hikers in the year 2003 who decided to scramble up a steep and dangerous slope far above the trail. They were more than 550 feet above the river in an area that required hand-over-hand climbing. This was a place where no 3-year-old could ever go on his own. It was a vertical nightmare of jagged rocks and loose scree, and there on a lonely ledge they found the fragments of a life. They found a single tooth. They found a tiny blue fleece jacket that had been bleached grey by the sun. They found a pair of small running shoes. The microscopic observation of those remains tells a story that the official reports refuse to acknowledge. The clothing was not torn to shreds by a mountain lion or a bear. The jacket was found inside out, but it was largely intact. The shoes still had the socks tucked neatly inside them. There was no blood on the rocks. There was no sign of a struggle. A predator like a lion kills with violence and leaves a trail of gore. It does not carefully remove the clothing of its prey and leave it in a neat pile on a ledge that is physically impossible for the victim to reach. The physics of the location defy every conventional explanation offered by the park rangers. To carry a 30-pound child up a 500-foot cliff without leaving a single drop of blood or a tuft of hair is a feat that no known animal can perform. And if Jaryd had climbed up there himself, he would have been the greatest mountaineer in human history. He would have had to do it in the middle of a massive search operation without being seen by a single person or a single helicopter. The reality is far more disturbing. Something or someone moved Jaryd Atadero from the trail to that ledge. Something that does not leave tracks. Something that can move through the forest with a silent and terrifying efficiency that we cannot comprehend. I have spent many nights staring at the photos of that ledge. I think about the silence that must have been there when those clothes were laid out. There is a sense of deliberateness to it. It feels like a display. It is as if the mountain was returning a borrowed item after it had finished with it. This is not the work of a random accident. It is the signature of a phenomenon that has been occurring in our national parks for over a century. We are dealing with a predator that operates on a different frequency. It is a shadow that lives in the periphery of our vision, and it knows exactly when we are not looking. The case of Jaryd Atadero is a mirror of another tragedy that happened decades earlier. In the year 1958, a 10-year-old boy named Bobby Bizup was staying at Camp St. Malo near the base of Long's Peak. Bobby had a slight hearing impairment and wore thick glasses, but he was a capable child. He was walking a very short distance from a fishing hole back to his cabin. He was in an area that was teeming with other children and counselors. He vanished in the middle of a sunny afternoon without a single person hearing a cry for help. The search for Bobby was exhaustive. The military was called in, and they combed every inch of the forest. For an entire year there was nothing. Then his remains were found high on a jagged ridge in a location that was deemed inaccessible to a child of his age and condition. Just like Jaryd, his clothing was found in a state that suggested it had been placed there rather than dragged by an animal. His glasses, which he needed to navigate the world, were never found. The similarities are not a coincidence. They are a pattern. Both boys vanished from high-traffic areas. Both were found in impossible locations at much higher elevations. Both cases involved a total lack of physical evidence at the scene of the disappearance. We are taught from birth that the world is a known quantity. We have mapped the mountains, and we have named the trees. But there are pockets of the earth where the rules are different. There are places where the veil between what we know and what we fear is very thin. The high peaks of Colorado are full of these thin spots. There is a presence in those woods that does not have a name in our scientific journals. It is something ancient and patient. It is a silent harvester that waits for the moment of distraction. It waits for the 1 second when a parent turns away or a hiker stops to catch their breath. When you look at these cases as a whole, you start to see the outline of something truly horrific. It is a threat that can bypass our senses and our technology. It does not care about your whistles or your bear spray. It is a master of the landscape that can move a human being through miles of rugged terrain without leaving a trace. We call it a mystery because we are too afraid to call it a hunt. The authorities offer us hollow explanations about mountain lions and exposure because they cannot admit that they are powerless against what is actually out there. They would rather you believe in a hungry cat than a tear in reality. The fragments of Jaryd Atadero and Bobby Bizup are not just cold cases. They are warnings. They are a testament to the fact that we are not the masters of this world. No matter how many trails we blaze or how many maps we draw, the wilderness remains a realm of ancient power. When you walk into the high country, you are stepping into a place where you are no longer at the top of the food chain. There are things in the stone and in the shadows that have been here much longer than we have. They have their own laws and their own hungers. I have walked those trails and I have felt the hair on my neck stand up for no reason. I have heard the silence that is too heavy to be natural. We like to think we are safe because we stay on the path, but the path is an illusion. The mountain can reach out and take you whenever it chooses. It can pull you into a vertical nightmare and leave you on a lonely ledge 500 feet above the world you knew. And by the time the sun sets, you will be nothing more than a memory and a faded piece of blue fleece. The pattern of these disappearances is not limited to Colorado. It is a global phenomenon that targets the young and the vulnerable. In the year 1938, a 4-year-old boy named Alfred Balehartz was hiking with his family in the Rocky Mountain National Park. He was walking just a few feet ahead of his parents when he disappeared. A massive search was launched, but Alfred was never found. However, a couple on a high ridge later reported seeing a small boy standing on a cliff edge far above them. By the time rescuers reached that inaccessible spot, the boy was gone. The mountains continue to collect their toll, and we continue to look the other way. There is something in the high peaks that is watching us, and it is very, very hungry.